and welcome to Talk to the Author. I'm Nadia Giordana. I have an exciting guest today. Her name is Alexis Acker-Halbur. She's an author. She's written several books, some fiction, some nonfiction. And I, for one, am very interested in hearing more about her backstory. I think you will be too. Let's go talk to Alexis and find out more. Alexis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nadia. It's great to be here.
I wanted to ask you, you've written at least 3 books. What got you started writing in the first place?
I love stories, and I grew up reading as many stories as I possibly could. I had a rough childhood, and so escaped into books. And then about the age of 15, because I had been abused by my father, writing gave me a very cathartic way to start healing. And so I started writing poetry. And poetry led to short stories. And then when I got into college, I actually started writing more short stories. And then I was launched into fiction. And I actually wrote 3 fiction books before I published my nonfiction. And the 3 were published by a publisher who's gone out of business. I hope it wasn't because of my writings, but anyways, it was a trilogy, and I just loved writing that trilogy. So now I'm here, and I'm writing nonfiction, poetry, and not so much the short stories anymore.
Well, I'm wondering about that switching between fiction and nonfiction. Were there challenges? Do you prefer one over the other? But were there challenges? As you said, you wrote several books, fiction, and then switched to nonfiction, and now you're back to fiction again. Is there a big effort in making that switch? How do you get your head into that different framework?
Well, it was a difficult switch to write nonfiction after fiction. I used fiction as a way to let out my creativity, and it was really cool to be able to write fiction, because we all know in fiction there are very few rules other than the formatting for a fiction novel. But I love the freedom. I love the fact that I could call the characters what I wanted them to be called, and they basically told me how they wanted to react in the story. So it is true, characters do tell authors how to write. And then I switched over to nonfiction, and that was because I had a devastating story to tell. And so I went with nonfiction, but in a way it was partly fiction as well, because I don't use anyone's name. I don't give any locations as to where I came from and things like that.
I think this is a good point to tell a little bit about that story that you just mentioned that inspired some of your writing. And when you got to a point where you were able to tell that story, did you have the support of family and friends, or were you all alone out there on that limb?
Well, the first nonfiction book is called Never Give Up: Break the Connection Between Stress and Illness. And it was about the abuse I suffered as a young girl and then growing up. And I started getting sick at a very early age. And I came to realize later in life that it was because as a child, I didn't know how to cope with healing from the abuse that I was suffering. And so I went and, just started to live my life, but every so often an illness would come up. So it started out with a kidney infection when I was little, and then it progressed to type 1 diabetes when I was 15, and then came along high blood pressure, depression, up until 50 when I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and that I had it twice. And both times the doctors gave me a 6% chance of survival. I prayed one night to see how I could stay alive, and the answer came back, write your story about abuse. And so I did. And I stopped and started writing that book, and it took me, I think, almost 5 years to write the book. But my family disowned me for writing that book. Even though I didn't mention names or where I was from, they felt that I was sabotaging their reputations, which I had no dream of doing. So I didn't use their names, I didn't use the locations. And so even today, they still disown me. So there's not a whole lot I can do about that.
Do you have advice? What kind of advice do you have for someone else out there that might have a sensitive story they'd like to get out, or even at the very least, let go of?
As I said before, writing was very, very cathartic for me. And to write is to heal. And so I would advise anyone who's undergone a traumatic experience to start writing down things. And one of the things that I did after I wrote Never Give Up, I also wrote a workbook to help people write about their trauma. And the workbook is called the Truth Program, and Truth stands for the Road to Unresolved Trauma Healing. And in this workbook, I can start you out by telling your story and asking you how you feel about the trauma and what you're doing to get better. And what I found in my own life is that we have to, in order to heal completely from trauma, we have to balance our mind, bodies, and spirits. And so that's what I always ask my readers and writers to do, is to balance all three of those, because if you don't, you're not going to heal.
And your latest book, that's good advice, by the way. Your latest book, The Bear, that's also based on the trauma and your childhood story loosely. Am I correct?
That is correct. And The Bear is about a story of a young woman who decides that life has become too rough to live. And so she goes off to Banning State Park. Yes, that's Banning State Park right here in the state of Minnesota, which is one of my favorite state parks. Anyway, she goes off to Banning during a February blizzard because she's going to end her life. And the reason why she's going to end her life is because she can no longer live with her father's abuse. And he's still, at the time of the novel, he's still abusing her verbally, and he's, trying to, overcome her with fear. And so that's what the book is about, but it is it is fiction. So, and it isn't directly my own life experience, but I do tap on a few experiences I had, such as the emotions. I can bring those back. with relative ease. And I think most people who've gone through trauma can.
I think so too. I wonder, was it easier to write that story as fictionalized and drawing on it the way you did? Do you think that was easier than if you'd tried to write the complete, pure, raw story?
I really like how I handled it by writing the nonfiction first and then switching over to fiction. I had a lot of people who read Never Give Up who were concerned about, the whole issue of child abuse. And, it's a pandemic in itself. And it goes on in our own neighborhoods, which is really scary when you consider the amount of adult children survivors of abuse there are in this world. And so writing the fictional version was actually easier because, again, I could bring in things that normally wouldn't happen. And one of the things that I did is I read the book The Shack by William P. Young, and I love that book. I absolutely love that book. And I decided I was going to write a shack book. And so The Bear became my shack book. And it's about love versus hate and fear versus death. So, it has some mystical elements to it, but I just loved working and writing on this book.
That makes complete sense to me. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
With about 2 minutes left, let's talk a little bit about some of the things. Of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so author appearances are much more difficult than they were, say, a couple of years ago. Tell me a little bit about what you are able to do to help people see and hear about your book, or anything else that you'd like to talk about.
Sure. Well, the one thing I'd like to do is I'm not only a writer, but I'm an advocate for people who are recovering from trauma. And so if you go to my website, which is https://nevergiveupinstitute.org, you can see the writings, my blogs on trauma healing, and a few other things I throw in there every now and then. But you can also see the books that I've written, and I tell you where you can order them, so it makes it very easy. But there's a video on my website that I think readers who have gone through trauma should watch because it's my true story.
Wonderful. Alexis, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Nadia. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe we'll be able to do it again sometime. You're probably not done writing books just yet, I'm assuming.
Not quite. I still have
All
a lot
right.
to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Let's talk to the author, and we'll see you next time with a brand new guest.